Welcome to Nocturnal Tales. Tonight we travel to Belgium in the autumn of 1919, to a Ghent still shining with rain, still ringing with church bells, and still trying to breathe after the long nightmare of war. The cafes have reopened, the canals are dark beneath the bridges, and the streets are once again full of life. But beneath that brave surface lies another Belgium. Empty pockets, missing sons, black market francs, deserters, smugglers, and men who learned during the occupation that a revolver could settle an argument faster than a magistrate. As always, this tale is inspired by the spirit of the great Golden Age crime writers, but the plot, characters, and text you're about to hear are our own creation. Though the historical epilogue at the end draws on the real Van Hove gang, whose brutal crimes haunted post-war Flanders. This episode is brought to you by the listeners who support Nocturnal Tales on Patreon and by those who help with one-off tips on Buy Me a Coffee or PayPal. If you'd like to support our work, you'll find all the links in the description. Our ebook, Nocturnal Tales, The Collected Mysteries, Volume 2, is also available now for $3.99. 8 earlier mysteries, rewritten and expanded for the page, with original Art Deco illustrations throughout. You can find it on Patreon, Gumroad, and Buy Me a Coffee. Links in the description. Now, settle in as the motorcar crosses the damp cobbles of Ghent, as a magistrate opens a folder tied with green tape, and as our detective begins to understand that the most dangerous road in Belgium is not the one where bodies are found, but the black road of memory, profit, and fear. Chapter 1. The Man Who Was Already Dead. It was in the autumn of 1919, when Europe had begun to breathe again, though not yet with ease, that Poirot and I travelled to Ghent. I had imagined Belgium, after the armistice, as a country emerging with dignity from a long nightmare. And so it was, in part. The streets were full again, the bells rang, cafes had reopened, women sold flowers at the corners, soldiers, thinner and older than their years, sat in doorways and smoked in silence. But beneath that brave surface there was another Belgium, one of empty pockets, missing sons, black market francs, deserters, smugglers, and men who had learned during the war that a revolver could solve difficulties faster than a magistrate. It was this Belgium which had brought us to Ghent. "Mon ami," said Poirot, adjusting his gloves as our motor-car rolled across the damp cobbles. "You observe? The city is beautiful, yes, but it is also nervous." I looked out at the grey facades, the canals dark beneath the bridges, the narrow streets shining after rain. Nervous? I should have said melancholy. Poirot gave me the look he reserves for generous stupidity. Melancholy sits still, Hastings. Nervousness looks over its shoulder. As if to prove his point, a man standing beside a shuttered tobacco shop turned sharply as our car passed. He was broad, with a cap pulled low, and a scarf hiding most of his jaw. He watched us too long. Then he vanished into an alley. I confess it sent a chill through me. Our invitation had come from Monsieur Paul de Groot, examining magistrate attached to the Ghent court. He was an old acquaintance of Poirot's from before the war, and his letter had been brief. There is a gang operating between Ghent, Bruges, and the countryside. Robberies, assaults, perhaps murders, the newspapers call them common bandits. I am not so sure. Come if you can. Come quietly. Poirot, of course, had come. We were taken first, not to the police headquarters, as I expected, but to a modest house on the Coupure, where Monsieur de Groot received us in a study crowded with papers and tobacco smoke. He was a lean man with tired eyes and a scholar's stoop, but his hand, when he shook mine, was dry and firm. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, "I regret bringing you to Belgium for such ugly business." Poirot bowed. "Belgium has seen uglier, my friend. Sit, Hastings. We listen." De Groote unlocked a drawer and removed a folder tied with green tape. "In the past 18 months, there have been 27 armed robberies in East and West Flanders. Farms, isolated houses, small businesses, one postal cart. At first we believed them opportunistic. Food, money, jewellery, clothing, the usual post-war thefts. But then people began to die." He laid photographs upon the desk. "I have seen death in war, but there is something colder in murder. A dead soldier is tragic. A murdered civilian is an accusation." "This man," said de Groote, touching the first photograph, "Jan Meis, farmer near Alter, shot while opening his stable door. His wife swore the killer wore a police coat." "A disguise?" I asked. "Perhaps. This one, Clement van de Putte, merchant of grain. Found in a ditch outside Deens. Robbed, yes, but his purse still contained 300 francs. "That is odd," I said. Poirot said nothing. His eyes had narrowed. De Groote placed down the third photograph. A woman this time. Elderly, neatly dressed, her face turned slightly aside as if embarrassed by the indignity of being dead. "Madame Leontine Verhege," said de Groote. "Widow. Lived alone outside Bruges. Killed during a robbery. But again, not everything was taken. Silver left behind. A gold watch untouched." "Then robbery may not have been the true motive," I said, pleased to have reached a conclusion. Poirot sighed very gently. "Hastings, one swallow does not make the spring, and one untouched watch does not make a conspiracy. Continue, Monsieur de Groote." The magistrate gave the faintest smile. "There is more. At several scenes we found the same mark." He took from the folder a small paper envelope. Inside was a scrap of black cloth, roughly cut into the shape of a triangle. "A token?" I asked. "That is what the newspapers would enjoy. A gang symbol, a secret brotherhood. But I mistrust theatrical explanations." "As do I," said Poirot. "Criminals are vain, but they are also practical. If they leave a sign, it is often because they want you to look at the sign and not at something else." De Groote leaned forward. 3 weeks ago, we arrested a man called Victor van Hove. A brute, but not a fool. He served during the war, deserted in 1918, and since then has kept company with smugglers, thieves, and former soldiers. We believe he leads the gang. With him is a man named Jules Verstuift, smaller, quieter, more dangerous. "Evidence?" asked Poirot. "Witnesses, stolen goods, weapons, but nothing firm enough to hang the murders on them." "Then why summon me?" De Groote's expression changed. For the first time I saw real unease in him. "Because last night Victor van Hove escaped from custody." I sat upright. "Escaped?" "During transfer from Ghent to Brussels. 2 guards injured, 1 dead." Poirot did not move. "And Verstuift?" "Still at large. We think he arranged it." I expected Poirot to ask at once about the escape, the guards, the route. Instead, he picked up the photograph of Madame Verhege and studied it. "This widow," he said softly. "Who identified the body?" De Groote blinked, surprised by the question. "Her niece, Mademoiselle Elise Verhege. She lives in Ghent." "And what did Madame Verhege possess that others might want?" "Very little. Some savings. Family jewellery. A house." Poirot shook his head. No, that is what one writes in the inventory. What did she possess that someone feared?" Before de Groote could reply, There came a sharp knock at the study door. A clerk entered, pale and breathless, holding a telegram. "Monsieur le Juge," he said, "from Bruges, marked urgent." De Groot snatched it open. I saw his face harden as he read. "What is it?" I asked. He passed the telegram to Poirot. Poirot read it once, then again. Finally, he handed it to me. "Body found this morning near Canal Road outside Damme, male, approximately 40, identified by papers as Victor Van Hove." I stared at the words. "But that is impossible," I said. "You told us Van Hove escaped last night." "Yes," said de Groot. Poirot rose and went to the window. Outside, Ghent lay wet and grey under the lowering sky. A barge moved slowly along the canal, black against the water. At last he turned. "It is not impossible, Hastings. It is merely inconvenient." "Inconvenient for whom?" Poirot smiled, but there was no amusement in it. "For the dead man, certainly. For the police, undoubtedly. But most of all, I think, for the murderer." De Groot took up his hat. "We leave for Damme immediately." Poirot brushed an invisible speck from his sleeve. "Excellent. But first, my friend, send a man to find Mademoiselle Elise Verhege." "The widow's niece. Why?" "Because," said Poirot, "if Victor Van Hove is dead, then someone has taken great trouble to kill a man whom the police already had. That is not the act of a common bandit." He looked again toward the canal. "It is the act of a person who is tidying the past." Chapter 2. The corpse beside the canal. The road to Damme was a melancholy business. It ran through flat country where the sky seemed too large for the earth beneath it. The fields, soaked by recent rain, lay black and shining. Here and there stood a farmhouse with its shutters closed against the damp, and occasionally we passed a peasant cart or a solitary cyclist who drew aside to let our motor car go by, staring after us with that particular Flemish suspicion which says plainly, "I know nothing, and if I did, I should tell you less." Monsieur de Groot sat opposite Poirot and me, holding his hat between his knees. "The body was found at dawn," he said. "A canal worker saw something among the reeds." "And the papers?" asked Poirot. "In the dead man's inside pocket. Military pass, old ration cards, 2 letters. All in the name of Victor Van Hove." "Convenient," said Poirot. "Too convenient?" Poirot smiled. "My friend, convenience is not always falsehood. Sometimes the truth is very obliging, but it is never lazy. This is lazy." I looked at him. "You mean it may not be Van Hove?" "I mean, Hastings, that when a dead man is considerate enough to carry all his identification neatly upon him, one must at least thank him by doubting it." De Groot nodded gravely. "There is also this. The dead guard from last night's escape was shot at close range. Van Hove was seen leaving the transfer wagon alive." "By whom?" asked Poirot sharply. "By the surviving guard." "A reliable man?" "Yes, wounded but conscious. He gave his statement before losing much blood." Poirot tapped one gloved finger against the window frame. "Then either the man found today is not Van Hove, or Van Hove had the misfortune to escape one prison only to enter another." We reached the canal road shortly before noon. A small crowd had gathered, held back by 2 gendarmes in dark capes. Beyond them, beside a fringe of reeds, lay the body. I had seen worse sights, but seldom one so dreary. The dead man was sprawled half on the bank, half in the mud, as though he had crawled or been dragged there. His clothes were coarse and dark, the boots cracked, one sole split. His face was turned upward to the blank Belgian sky. He was a powerfully built fellow, somewhere about 40, with a heavy jaw and a broken nose. One cheek had been scraped raw, perhaps by stone or gravel. There was blood at the collar, blackened by rain. De Groot bent over him. "That is Van Hove," he said quietly. "You are certain?" "I saw him after his arrest." Poirot stood very still. "Then we proceed from that fact. The identity is true." I confess I was surprised. Poirot usually delights in proving everyone wrong, and I had half expected him to declare the corpse that of a travelling umbrella salesman or a missing bishop. He walked round the body with exquisite care, keeping his polished shoes clear of the mud. "Shot?" I asked. "One wound," said de Groot. "In the neck, perhaps upward into the head. The doctor has not yet examined him fully." Poirot crouched. "Not here," he murmured. "What? He was not shot here." The examining magistrate looked toward the reeds. "There is blood. Yes, but not enough. A man shot through the neck bleeds, my friend. He bleeds with enthusiasm. Here we have only the remains of travel." "Travel?" I said. Poirot pointed. "Look at the shoulder, Hastings. Mud pressed into the cloth. Here also the heel marks. He was dragged." De Groot called one of the gendarmes, who confirmed that no firearm had been found nearby. Poirot asked to see the contents of the dead man's pockets. They were laid out upon a handkerchief: papers, a few francs, a cheap knife, a twist of tobacco, and a small brass button. Poirot picked up the button. "Not from his coat," he said. "No," said de Groot. "The coat buttons are bone." The brass button was dull, dented, and engraved with the faint outline of a lion. "A military button," I suggested. "Perhaps," said Poirot. "Or perhaps something more theatrical." He slipped it back onto the cloth and turned to the gendarme. "Who first touched the body?" The man, a red-faced fellow with a walrus moustache, saluted. "The canal worker, monsieur. He turned him over, then ran to fetch us." "Where is this worker?" "At the lock cottage." We found him there. A thin, nervous man named Peters, smelling strongly of damp wool and pipe smoke. He stood twisting his cap in both hands while de Groot questioned him. He had found the body at 6:30. He had touched it only to see whether the man lived. He had seen no one on the road except a milk cart and a woman in black walking toward Damme. "A woman?" asked Poirot. The canal worker shrugged. "Many women wear black now, monsieur." "Old? Young?" "Not old, not young. She walked fast." "Did she look at the body?" "No, monsieur." "She was on which side of the road?" The man hesitated. "The far side, near the poplars." Poirot's moustaches gave the faintest quiver. "Near the poplars? Bon." As we left the lock cottage, I said, "You think the woman important?" "I think people who walk fast past corpses are either very brave, very blind, or very well informed." We returned to Ghent in the late afternoon, carrying with us no solution but a considerable increase in discomfort. De Groot had arranged for Mademoiselle Elise Verhaeghe to be brought to his office. We found her waiting there. She was perhaps 28, pale, neatly dressed, and painfully composed. There was nothing remarkable in her appearance except her eyes, which were steady but tired, as if they had spent too long refusing to weep. "You wished to speak to me about my aunt?" she asked. Poirot bowed. "About your aunt, yes. Also about Victor Van Hove." At that name her hands tightened very slightly in her lap. "You knew him?" asked de Groot. "No." The answer came too quickly. Poirot did not challenge it. He merely sat opposite her and said in his gentlest voice, "Mademoiselle, your aunt was murdered during a robbery. Yet certain valuables were not taken. That suggests the robbers sought something particular. Do you know what that might have been?" "No." "Did she keep papers?" "Old letters, receipts. Nothing of value." "Letters from whom?" "My uncle. He died before the war." "No other correspondence?" She looked down. My aunt was a private woman. "And frightened?" This time she looked directly at Poirot. Yes. Of whom? I do not know. Again, too quick. Poirot leaned back. Did she ever mention the name Van Hove? A faint flush touched her face. No. Before Poirot could continue, the door opened, and de Groot's clerk entered with a note. He gave it silently to the magistrate. De Groot read it, then looked at Poirot. The surviving guard from last night's escape has regained consciousness. Excellent. He has amended his statement. Poirot's eyes sharpened. In what way? He now says Van Hove did not escape alone. A woman was waiting by the roadside. Mademoiselle Verheyen rose so abruptly that her chair scraped against the floor. I am unwell, she said. Poirot stood too and bowed with perfect courtesy. Of course, mademoiselle, we shall not detain you. But as she turned toward the door, something slipped from her glove and fell to the carpet. It was a small triangle of black cloth. Chapter 3. The Black Triangle. For a moment no one moved. The little triangle of black cloth lay upon the carpet as innocently as a fallen leaf, and yet I could not have stared at it more if it had been a viper. Mademoiselle Elise Verheyen looked at it, then at Poirot. Then very slowly she bent to retrieve it. Poirot was quicker. With a movement so neat that it seemed almost impolite, he picked it up between finger and thumb. "Permit me, mademoiselle." "It is mine," she said. "That I do not doubt. Then kindly return it." Poirot bowed, but did not immediately obey. An unusual keepsake. "It is mourning cloth." "Ah. For your aunt?" Her lips tightened. "For Belgium, monsieur. There has been enough mourning to justify 1,000 such scraps." It was well answered. Even de Groot, who had been watching her closely, seemed momentarily checked. Poirot placed the cloth on the desk. "And yet this little piece resembles others found beside the crimes attributed to Van Hove and Verstuft." "I know nothing of that." "Mademoiselle, did you see Victor Van Hove last night?" "No." "Did you aid his escape?" "No." "Were you walking this morning near the Canal road outside Damme?" Her face changed. Not much. A less attentive man than Poirot might have missed it. I, being trained by long suffering, did not. "I was in Ghent." "All morning?" "Yes." "Can anyone confirm that?" "My landlady." "Excellent. We shall ask her." A short silence followed. Then Mademoiselle Verheyen said in a lower voice, "You have no right to question me as though I were a criminal." De Groot intervened. "Mademoiselle, a dangerous man escaped last night. That same man was found dead this morning. Your aunt was one of his supposed victims, and now you are found carrying a mark connected with his gang. Surely you see the difficulty." "I see only that grief makes a woman suspicious in the eyes of men." She said it with dignity, and I confess I felt a pang of sympathy. There was something in her face that did not suggest guilt so much as terror kept under discipline. Poirot, however, remained unmoved. "Terror is a very good reason for silence," he said. "But it is not always a safe one." She looked at him then, and for one brief instant the composure cracked. "If I speak, I am dead." The words came out almost before she knew she had said them. De Groot leaned forward. "Who has threatened you?" But already the mask had returned. "No one. I am tired. I wish to go home." Poirot considered her, then took up the black triangle and folded it carefully. "You may go, mademoiselle, but you will not leave Ghent." She gave a little bitter smile. "Monsieur, no one truly leaves Ghent. Not now." And with that she went. When the door had closed behind her, de Groot exhaled sharply. She knows something. Evidently, said Poirot. "Then we should detain her." "For what? Possessing a scrap of cloth? Being afraid? Lying badly? Half Belgium has done all three since 1914. The magistrate frowned. "You let her go too easily." Poirot shook his head. "No, I let her go because she is being watched." "By whom?" Poirot turned to me. "Hastings, when we entered this house earlier, did you observe the man across the canal?" I searched my memory and found, to my annoyance, very little. "A man?" "There were several. This one had a blue worker's jacket and carried a basket. But he bought nothing, sold nothing, and moved when Mademoiselle Verhaeghe's carriage arrived." "You think he followed her?" "I think he was placed to see who wished to speak with her." De Groot rang for his clerk and gave instructions that Mademoiselle Verhaeghe was to be discreetly watched. Poirot requested also that inquiries be made about a woman in black seen near Damme, and about any military uniform or civil service livery using a brass lion button. We had barely completed these arrangements when a second visitor was announced, Inspector van der Velde of the Ghent police. He was a thick-set man with a square head, a clipped moustache, and the expression of one who had been interrupted in the act of disbelieving everybody. His boots were muddy, his coat smelled faintly of rain and tobacco, and he regarded Poirot with a politeness that contained no warmth whatsoever. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, "you have come from Brussels to teach us how to arrest men we already arrested." Poirot smiled. "No, monsieur. I have come to learn why men you arrested are now dead." The inspector grunted. It might have been respect. It might have been indigestion. "I have news," he said to de Groot. "A farmhouse near Epilogue was robbed last night." "Last night," said the magistrate, "during Van Hove's escape." "Yes. 3 masked men. The farmer was beaten. His wife says they asked not for money, but for a locked chest belonging to her brother." Poirot became very still. "Her brother?" "A former quartermaster in the army. Died of influenza 6 months ago. And the chest? Taken. What was in it? According to the wife, old ledgers, army forms, private papers. Nothing worth stealing." Poirot and de Groot exchanged a glance. I felt the excitement of the chase stir in me. "So there is something in these papers," I cried. "Something that connects the robberies." "Perhaps," said Poirot. Van der Velde looked sceptical. "Or perhaps thieves heard there was a chest and expected money." Poirot nodded pleasantly. "Indeed, criminals are often disappointed by literature." The inspector ignored this. "There is more. The farmer's wife recognized one of the voices, Jules Verstuft." At that name, de Groot's face hardened. "Then he is still in the district." "Unless she is mistaken." "Was the black triangle left?" asked Poirot. Van der Velde turned to him. "Yes." "Where?" "Pinned to the barn door." "Pinned?" Poirot repeated softly. "Yes." "With what?" The inspector hesitated. "A woman's hat pin." This produced a silence. "A hat pin?" I said. Van der Velde nodded. "Long silver pin, cheap, common enough." Poirot took out his notebook. "A woman at the Canal, a woman perhaps at the escape, a woman's hat pin at Epilogue, and Mademoiselle Verhaeghe with the black triangle." "You think she is part of the gang?" I asked. "No, Hastings. I think someone very much wishes us to think about women." De Groot rose. "We should go to Epilogue." "Presently," said Poirot. "First, I would like to see Van Hove's body again." The inspector gave a short laugh. "He has not changed since noon." "Corpses rarely do, but observers sometimes improve." We went to the mortuary, a bleak tiled room behind the hospital where the air was cold and sharp with disinfectant. Van Hove lay beneath a sheet. The police surgeon, an elderly man with pince-nez, gave his report in dry tones. Death had occurred between midnight and 4 in the morning. The wound had been made by a small-caliber pistol, fired close. There were bruises on the wrists, mud on the back, and, most curious of all, a deep scratch across the palm of the right hand. "A struggle?" I asked. "Possibly," said the surgeon. Poirot bent over the hand. His face showed sudden interest. "No, this is not from a struggle." "What then?" asked de Groot. Poirot did not answer. He examined the nails, the cuff, the torn skin. Then he turned the dead man's coat slightly aside and looked at the lining. There, half hidden in a seam, was a smear of pale yellow dust. Poirot touched it with the tip of a folded paper. "Brick dust," I suggested. "No, Hastings." "Clay?" "Perhaps." The surgeon peered at it. "Looks like grain powder to me. Flour, maybe." Poirot straightened. Van Hoe escaped from a guarded wagon, crossed the countryside, met someone who shot him, was dragged to a canal road, and somehow acquired flour in his coat lining. Inspector van der Velde folded his arms. "You make it sound absurd." "It is absurd, monsieur. Therefore it is probably important." At that precise moment the door opened and de Groot's clerk appeared once more, breathless as ever. "Monsieur le Juge." "What now?" "The men watching Mademoiselle Verhaeghe report that she has left her lodging." De Groot swore under his breath. "Where has she gone?" The clerk swallowed. "To the old grain warehouse by the Lys." Poirot glanced down at the yellow dust on the paper. "Ah," he said quietly. "Then we also go to the grain warehouse." Van der Velde reached for his revolver. Poirot looked at him sharply. "Not too loudly, monsieur. If Mademoiselle Verhaeghe has gone there willingly, she may be guilty. If unwillingly, she may already be as good as dead." Chapter 4. The Warehouse by the Lys. The old grain warehouse stood on the river like a thing forgotten by commerce and remembered by crime. It was a long brick building with blind upper windows, a sagging slate roof, and great wooden doors blackened by years of weather. The Lys moved behind it, dark and sluggish, carrying with it the smell of mud, rotting reeds, and wet rope. Inspector van der Velde had brought 4 men. They spread themselves along the quay with revolvers drawn, while Monsieur de Groot remained close to Poirot and me. "No shouting," said Poirot, "no heroics. Above all, no shooting unless there is no alternative." Van der Velde gave him a hard look. "These men murdered a guard. Then we shall not improve matters by murdering a witness." "A witness?" Poirot looked at the warehouse. "Mademoiselle Verhaeghe is either inside because she chose to come, or because someone chose for her. In both cases, she may know more than any dead man." The inspector grunted, but he signaled his men to wait. We entered through a side door, its lock already broken. Inside, the air was cold and full of dust. Shafts of grey afternoon light fell through cracks in the boards, turning the floating flour powder into pale smoke. Sacks were piled in uneven towers. Rats scurried somewhere above us. From the far end came the faint drip of water. Poirot stopped at once. "What is it?" I whispered. He pointed to the floor. There were footprints in the dust, small ones, a woman's, moving inward, larger ones following, then a confused patch where several men had stood. Van der Velde crouched. 3 men at least. 4, said Poirot. 1 remained near the door. How do you know? Because he was bored. The inspector stared at him. Poirot indicated a scatter of match ends beside a crate. A man who waits smokes. A man who fears does not finish the cigarette. We moved on. Near the center of the warehouse stood a desk. an old clerk's desk with a cracked leather top. Upon it lay an oil lamp recently extinguished. Beside it was a length of black cloth, a penknife, and several scraps cut into triangles. "So," said de Groot softly, "the mark is made here." Van der Velde seized one of the scraps. "This is proof." "No," said Poirot, "this is theatre." The inspector's jaw tightened. "Monsieur Poirot, with respect, you call everything theatre." "Because everyone in this affair is performing. Van Hove the bandit, Verstuyft the phantom, the woman in black, the triangle on the barn door, all gestures, all designed to be seen." I picked up the penknife. "But who is the audience?" Poirot's eyes flicked toward me. "At last, Hastings, you ask the correct question." At that moment there was a muffled cry from above. Van der Velde sprang toward the stairs, but Poirot caught his sleeve. "Slowly." The stairs led to a narrow upper gallery lined with empty bins. Halfway along it, behind stacked planks, we found Mademoiselle Elise Verhaeghe. Her wrists were bound with cord. A cloth had been tied across her mouth. Her hat was gone, her hair loosened, and one cheek bore the red mark of a blow. I cut the gag while de Groot untied her hands. "Mademoiselle," said Poirot gently, "you are safe." She shook her head violently. "No, none of us is safe. Not while he has the book." "The book?" asked de Groot. She pressed her fingers to her lips, struggling for control. "They thought I had it. That my aunt had given it to me before she died. They dragged me here, asked me where it was." "Who?" She hesitated. Van der Velde said harshly, "Was it Verstuyft?" "I heard that name." "You saw him?" "No. They kept behind the lamp. One spoke Flemish, another French. The third said almost nothing." Poirot's attention sharpened. "French?" "Yes." "From Ghent?" "I do not know. Educated, perhaps." Van der Velde snorted. "Bandits with education. Next you will say they wore gloves." "They did," said Mademoiselle Verhaeghe. That checked him. Poirot nodded slowly. "Tell me about the book." "My aunt's ledger. She kept accounts for a military supply office during the occupation, secretly. Names, deliveries, payments. She said after the war it would matter. Then men began coming to her house, asking questions, threatening her. Was Victor Van Hove one of them? I do not know." "But you knew the name." Her eyes filled with fear. "My aunt said it once. She said, if Van Hove is taken, others will be afraid." De Groot and Van der Velde exchanged glances. "Where is this ledger now?" asked the magistrate. "I swear I do not know. My aunt hid it." Poirot studied her face. "You came here because you received a message." She looked startled. "How did you know?" "Because a frightened woman does not walk into an abandoned warehouse unless fear behind her is greater than fear before her." She reached into the pocket of her coat and drew out a folded paper. It was written in large, clumsy capitals. "Bring the book to the warehouse by the lists, or you will join your aunt." Beneath it was a black triangle. Van der Velde cursed. "They were gone when we arrived?" "Yes," she said, "perhaps 10 minutes before. They heard something outside." "One of my men?" said the inspector. "Or one of theirs," said Poirot. "We searched the warehouse thoroughly, but found no hidden attacker. What we did find was almost as troubling. In a small locked office at the rear, forced open by Van der Velde's men, lay a military coat, 2 police caps, a box of cartridges, and 3 account pages torn from a ledger. The pages listed dates, initials, quantities of grain, boots, petrol, and medicines. Beside several entries was a small mark, a triangle blackened in ink. De Groot examined them with a grim face. "These are army supplies." "Stolen?" I asked. Diverted, perhaps. Sold during the war, perhaps. Poirot said nothing. He was looking at one entry. "What is it?" I asked. He covered the page with his hand. "A name that is not a name." Before I could ask more, a shot cracked outside. We all turned. A second shot followed, then a shout from the quay. Van der Velde ran first, revolver drawn. We hurried after him, down the stairs and into the open air. One of the policemen was kneeling beside the river wall, clutching his arm. Another pointed across the leas. "There! By the coal yard!" A figure in a dark coat was already disappearing between two warehouses on the opposite bank. Van der Velde fired once, uselessly. The figure vanished. Poirot, however, was not looking across the river. He was looking down. At the edge of the quay, caught on a splinter of wood, was a scrap of fabric. Not black cloth this time. Grey wool. Poirot picked it up carefully and held it to the light. "A uniform?" I asked. "Perhaps." "Belonging to the man who fired?" Poirot shook his head. "No, Hastings. I think it belongs to the man who did not wish to fire." From the river, a slow mist began to rise, and somewhere in Ghent, the hidden ledger waited, carrying names that someone was now willing to kill for. Chapter 5. The Name That Was Not a Name. It was nearly evening when we returned to Monsieur de Groot's office, and Ghent had become a city of lamps and shadows. The rain had ceased, but the streets still glittered blackly under the gaslight. From the cafes came the murmur of voices, subdued but persistent, as though the city wished to remind itself that it was alive. Yet everywhere there seemed to me to be watchers, a man beneath an awning, a woman at a window, a cyclist who passed us twice. I mentioned this to Poirot. He smiled faintly. "You begin to improve, Hastings. Suspicion is like influenza. Once caught, it spreads rapidly." Mademoiselle Verhege had been taken to a safe room under police protection. Inspector van der Velde, with considerable reluctance, had agreed not to arrest her. "She lied," he said. "Assuredly," replied Poirot. "Then she is involved." "My dear Inspector, everyone lies. The innocent lie from fear, the guilty from calculation, and the foolish from habit. Our task is to determine the flavor of the lie." Van der Velde looked as though he would have preferred his criminals without flavors. On the desk before us lay the 3 torn ledger pages recovered from the warehouse. De Groot had placed a shaded lamp close beside them, and the yellow light made the old ink look almost brown. "The initials," he said, tapping one column. "VH could be Victor van Hove." "Possibly," said Poirot, "and JV may be Jules Verstoeft." "Possibly." The magistrate frowned. "You dislike agreement, my friend." "I dislike initials. They are the cowards of handwriting." I bent over the paper. The entries were dull enough at first glance. Sacks of grain, boots, petrol tins, medical crates. But each line had a date from the war years, and beside certain items was drawn the little black triangle. "Those marked entries," I said, "must be the stolen goods." "Or the recorded goods," said Poirot. "What is the difference?" "The difference between theft and bookkeeping, Hastings, is sometimes only the respectability of the thief." He took one page and turned it slightly. "This entry interests me. Here. 23 crates, medicaments, delivered to M.V. "M.V., said de Groot. "Another gang member?" "Perhaps. But look below. M.V. appears again, then here as Monsieur V, and here as simply V." "That could be Van Hove?" said Van der Velde. Poirot shook his head. Victor Van Hove was not called Monsieur by a clerk who knew his business. The inspector snorted. "You can know that from one letter." "I can know that from vanity. A clerk may fear a bandit, but he does not flatter him in a private ledger." De Groot sat back. "Then who is Monsieur V?" Poirot looked at the page a moment longer, then folded his hands. "That is precisely the name which is not a name." I confess this remark irritated me. If it is not a name, what is it? "A door." "To what?" "To the person who has killed twice in order that we should not open it." Before I could reply, the clerk entered with a message. "The landlady of Mademoiselle Verhaeghe has been found, monsieur." A stout woman in black bombazine was shown in. She had the suspicious dignity of the respectable poor, and looked at us as though we were all trying to avoid paying rent. Her name was Madame Closs. Yes, Mademoiselle Verhaeghe lodged with her. No, she had not been at home that morning. Yes, she had returned pale and shaken. No, Madame Closs was not surprised. Young women who received letters from men generally became pale and shaken. Poirot leaned forward. "Letters from men?" Madame Closs pursed her lips. "I do not pry." This, in my experience, generally means that every envelope has been examined against the light. "But you noticed?" "She received one yesterday afternoon, delivered by hand, no stamp." "By whom?" "A boy, dirty face, cap too large." "And the handwriting?" "I did not look." Poirot sighed. "Madame, do not insult your own intelligence." She sniffed. It was an educated hand. French, not Flemish. Blue ink. De Groot glanced sharply at Poirot. "The warehouse note was in block capitals." "Exactly," said Poirot. Madame Closs continued, warming to her task despite herself. "And after receiving it, Mademoiselle burned something in the kitchen stove." "What?" "How should I know? It was burned." Poirot regarded her. She held out for almost 5 seconds. "There was a piece that did not catch. I took it out." "Of course you did," said Poirot approvingly. From her handbag she produced a blackened scrap of paper. On it were only a few surviving words. "Not trust the police. The ledger is where St. Elizabeth." "St. Elizabeth?" said Van der Velde. "The Béguinage," said de Groot. "There is the old St. Elizabeth Béguinage here in Ghent." Poirot's eyes shone. "Then we go there." The Béguinage, when we reached it, seemed at first the last place in Belgium for violence. Quiet little houses stood around a grassy court. Narrow windows glowed softly. The air held the smell of damp stone and old prayers. Women moved like shadows behind curtains. We were received by an elderly lay sister who knew Madame Verhaeghe. "She came here sometimes," the woman said, "to pray, to speak with Sister Agnès." "And Sister Agnès?" asked Poirot. "Dead. Influenza. Last winter." Poirot bowed his head. "Madame Verhaeghe left something here, perhaps?" The old woman hesitated. "She left a packet once. Said it was to be kept unless a young lady named Elise came for it." "Did Elise come?" "No." "Then the packet remains?" The woman looked frightened. "It was stolen." "When?" "2 nights before Madame Verhaeghe was killed." Van der Velde muttered an oath. "By whom?" "We do not know. A window was forced. Only the packet was taken." Poirot walked to the small parlour window. The catch was old, but recently repaired. Beneath it, outside in the soft earth, there remained the faintest impression of a boot heel. He knelt and examined it. "A soldier's boot," said de Groot. "Many men wear soldiers' boots now," said Poirot. "War distributes uniforms more generously than justice." The old woman suddenly made the sign of the cross. "There was something else. After the theft, we found this in the chapel." She opened a drawer and took out a brass button. The same dull lion design as the one found in Van Hoe's pocket. Poirot's face became grave. He placed the 2 buttons side by side in his palm. "Not police," he murmured. "Not army." "Then what?" I asked. He did not answer. At that instant, from somewhere beyond the quiet court, a bell began to ring. Not the solemn bell of prayer, but a harsh, panicked ringing. A young woman ran in, white-faced. "Monsieur, the police guard! Outside the Verhaeghe room! He has been stabbed!" De Groot seized his hat. Van der Velde was already at the door. "And Mademoiselle Verhaeghe?" cried I. The young woman looked from one face to another. "She is gone." Poirot closed his hand around the brass buttons. "No," he said softly. "She has not gone." "What do you mean?" He looked toward the darkening streets beyond the beguinage. "She has been taken to the one person she most fears, and also, I think, the one person she still hopes to trust." Chapter 6. The Ledger of the Dead. We reached the Verhaeghe safe room within minutes. The police guard lay in the corridor, pale but living, with a shallow wound beneath the ribs. He had been struck from behind, then stabbed when he turned. On the floor beside him was another black triangle. Inspector Van der Velde picked it up with a savage oath. "Verstuift." "No," said Poirot. The inspector turned on him. "No? You have a better ghost to offer us?" "I have a better man." Poirot bent over the wounded guard. "My friend, who attacked you?" The guard's lips moved. "Couldn't see. Coat collar up. But he said—" The man grimaced. "He said the magistrate had sent him." De Groot started. "I sent no one." "I know," said Poirot quietly. Van der Velde frowned. "Then where has she been taken?" Poirot looked not at the door, nor at the window, but at de Groot's desk, where the 3 torn ledger pages still lay beneath the lamp. "To the place where the ledger was never hidden," he said, "to Madame Verhaeghe's house." This seemed madness to me. But it was searched. Exactly, Hastings. Therefore everyone stopped seeing it. Within the hour we were outside the dead widow's little house, a narrow place with green shutters and a garden choked by rain-heavy weeds. 2 policemen covered the rear. Van der Velde kicked open the front door, and we went in. The parlour was dark. The smell of old furniture and cold ashes hung in the air. Then, from the room above, came a woman's cry. We rushed upstairs. In the bedroom, Mademoiselle Verhaeghe stood pressed against the wardrobe, white with terror. Before her was a man in a grey coat, one hand holding a pistol, the other clutching a leather-bound ledger. For a moment the lamplight caught his face. It was Inspector Van der Velde. I had seen him beside me on the stairs, or thought I had. But the man who had led the charge had been one of his constables. Van der Velde himself had vanished in the confusion at the door. He turned the pistol toward us. "Stay back!" De Groot stopped dead. I confess I did also. Poirot alone took one small step forward. "Put it down, monsieur." Van der Velde laughed harshly. "You knew?" "I suspected. I knew when you were too eager to see Verstuift everywhere." "Verstuift is real enough." "Oh, yes. A bandit. A killer, perhaps. But not the mind behind this affair." The inspector's face twitched. Poirot continued, calm as though discussing the weather. "During the war, supplies disappeared. Grain, petrol, boots, medicines. Not stolen by common thieves at first, but diverted by respectable men. Clerks, officers, officials, policemen. Madame Verhaeghe kept the accounts. After the armistice, those accounts became dangerous." De Groot stared at Van der Velde in horror. "Jules?" The use of the Christian name struck me. They had known one another longer than I realized. Van der Velde said nothing. Poirot pointed to the ledger. "There is your Monsieur V, not Van Hove, not Verstuift, Van der Velde, a policeman with access to warrants, files, prisoners, witnesses, and frightened people." "You cannot prove it." I can. The brass buttons were not police and not army. They are from the old civic guard coat stored in the municipal depot. You used such coats for disguises. One button was found on Van Hove, another at the beginnage. The grey cloth on the key came from the same coat. Flour in Van Hove's lining placed him at the warehouse before his death. He was brought there, questioned, killed, and dragged to Damme. Van der Velde's pistol hand tightened. Van Hove would have talked. "Yes," said Poirot. "He was not your leader. He was your loose end." Mademoiselle Verhaeghe gave a small sob. "My aunt knew." "Your aunt knew too much," said Poirot. "She hid the ledger not at the béguinage, not with Elise, but in the safest place, behind the false back of her own wardrobe. A woman like Madame Verhaeghe trusted habits. She had lived with that hiding place for years." I glanced at the wardrobe. Its rear panel hung open. Van der Velde smiled without warmth. "And now I have it." "No," said Poirot. He turned slightly. At the door behind us stood the wounded guard, supported by one of the constables. In his hand was a revolver. "You are surrounded, Jules," said de Groot, his voice breaking. "Put it down." For a dreadful second I thought Van der Velde would fire. Then Mademoiselle Verhaeghe, with more courage than I should have credited any person in her condition, struck his wrist with a brass candlestick from the dressing-table. The pistol went off, shattering the mirror. Van der Velde cried out. I sprang forward. So did the constables. In another moment he was disarmed and pinned against the bedstead, breathing hard, his face no longer that of an inspector, but of a cornered animal. The ledger fell to the floor. Poirot picked it up and handed it to de Groot. "There, my friend. Names, dates, quantities, payments. Not the romance of bandits. Merely the old crime. Profit from misery." Van der Velde looked at Poirot with hatred. "You think this ends it? Verstuyft is still out there." "Perhaps," said Poirot, "but without your protection he is only a rat in a field." And, indeed, within 3 weeks, Jules Verstuyft was taken near Bruges, betrayed by one of the lesser men who had once feared him. The newspapers made much of the capture of the gang, the stolen goods, the robberies, the murders. They made rather less of the officials whose names filled Madame Verhaeghe's ledger. That, Poirot remarked, was also a kind of crime. We remained in Ghent 2 days after Van der Velde's arrest. On the last morning, Mademoiselle Verhaeghe came to thank Poirot. She wore black still, but there was less fear in her face. "My aunt was not foolish, then?" she asked. Poirot took her hand gently. "No, mademoiselle. She was brave. But bravery sometimes waits many years before it is understood." As our train pulled away from Ghent, I looked back at the towers and wet roofs of that wounded city. "A grim business, Poirot." "Yes, Hastings. And not much like the crimes one reads about in detective stories." Poirot looked at me with great seriousness. "On the contrary, mon ami, it was exactly like them. There was a false clue, a hidden document, a dead man who told the truth, and a murderer who believed himself cleverer than justice." He leaned back, closed his eyes, and added, "But in real life, Hastings, the blood is colder, and the account books are uglier." Historical Epilogue: The Real Van Hove Verstuyft Gang. The case which inspired this story was not, in truth, a neat little mystery of the drawing-room kind. It belonged to a harder and uglier world. After the First World War, Belgium was exhausted. The countryside around Ghent and Bruges had not merely suffered hunger, occupation, loss, and uncertainty. It had also inherited men who had learned, in war, how easily violence could overturn ordinary life. Weapons were available. Money was scarce. Police structures were still catching up with the criminal disorder left behind by the conflict. Out of that chaos emerged the gang remembered as the Van Hove Verstuyft Gang. Their leaders were the brothers René and Edmund Verstuyft, together with Raymond Van Hove. Around them gathered a shifting circle of accomplices, informers, receivers of stolen goods, and violent opportunists. They operated in East and West Flanders, especially in the region around Ghent and Bruges. Their crimes were not elegant. They were brutal armed robberies, often directed at farms, isolated houses, and people believed to possess money, valuables, or supplies. The gang's methods were simple and frightening. Targets were often identified in advance. A tip would be given. The place would be watched. Then the robbers would arrive, sometimes disguised, sometimes armed like soldiers, and force their way in. Those who resisted, cried out, or tried to raise the alarm could be beaten or shot. The violence was not incidental. It was part of the gang's power. In total, 36 attacks were attributed to the gang. 14 people were murdered. One of the most notorious victims was Gentil de Meyer, the police commissioner of Mel. In July 1920, during an attempted arrest after a burglary, he was shot dead. His death became one of the symbols of the gang's savagery and of the danger faced by the police officers trying to restore order after the war. The investigation also marked an important moment in Belgian policing. The country had recently created a new judicial police intended to deal with serious crime in a more organized and professional way. The Van Hove case became one of the great tests of this new machinery of justice. In 1920, Edmund Verstoeft was arrested. His capture proved decisive. Soon other members were caught, and the gang began to unravel. The trial took place in Ghent in 1924 and became one of the great criminal spectacles of its time. Crowds came to follow the proceedings. Newspapers reported the evidence in detail. The public was fascinated and horrified in equal measure. It was not merely the scale of the crimes that shocked people, but the coldness with which they had been carried out. 10 members of the gang were sentenced to death, including the principal leaders. In practice, those death sentences were automatically commuted to life imprisonment. Others received sentences of hard labor or long prison terms, while some accused were acquitted. The fictional story you have just heard borrows the atmosphere of that real case. Post-war Ghent, frightened villages, violent robberies, a new police force, and a society still wounded by war. But the central mystery, the hidden ledger, the false clues, the corrupt official, and Poirot's investigation is entirely fictional. The real Van Hove affair was darker and less orderly than fiction. There was no single elegant solution, no final gathering in a drawing room, no brilliant speech that restored moral balance. There was instead a grim catalogue of raids, murders, betrayals, arrests, and a trial that forced Belgium to look directly at what the war had left behind. That is why the case remains so compelling. It was not only a story of criminals, it was a story of a country trying to become lawful again after years in which law had been weakened, hunger had been common, and violence had become familiar. The gang passed into Belgian criminal history because it represented a particular post-war terror, the fear that peace had returned in name only, and that the violence of the war had followed ordinary people back into their homes. Thank you for listening all the way to the end of The Black Road of Ghent. This was a case in which the apparent terror of a bandit gang concealed something colder and more respectable: wartime corruption, stolen army supplies, and a ledger that named the men who had profited while Belgium suffered. Victor Van Hove was not the mastermind. He was the loose end. The black triangles, the disguises, the whispered name of Verstoeft, the woman in black, the hat pin, the false theatrical clues. All of it was arranged to keep eyes fixed on common criminals, while the real danger stood inside the machinery of justice itself. Inspector van der Velde had not merely protected the gang, he had used them, hidden behind them, and finally killed to prevent Madame Verhege's ledger from exposing him. What our detective saw was that the clues were too eager to be seen. The black triangle was not a secret sign, but a stage prop. The buttons did not belong to police or army uniforms, but to old civic guard coats used as disguises. The flower in Van Hoe's coat placed him at the warehouse before his death. And the initials in the ledger were not the initials of a bandit at all, but the shadow of a respectable man who had mistaken his official position for immunity. The real affair had no neat drawing room solution, no single brilliant speech that restored moral order, only raids, murders, arrests, betrayals, and a society forced to confront what the war had left behind. That is why this story matters. It is not simply a mystery about a hidden ledger. It is a story about a country trying to become lawful again after years in which law itself had been weakened. It asks what happens when peace returns in name, but violence, hunger, corruption, and fear remain. If this kind of mystery stayed with you, the darker historical cases, the ones where the murderer hides behind institutions rather than alleyways, where the clues are staged and the truth lies buried in account books. Tell us in the comments when you first suspected Van der Velde, and whether you'd like more mysteries inspired by real post-war crimes. And if you'd like to support Nocturnal Tales and help keep these full-length mysteries coming, you'll find links in the description for Patreon and for one-off tips via Buy Me a Coffee or PayPal. Our ebook, Nocturnal Tales, The Collected Mysteries, Volume 2, is also available for $3.99 on Patreon, Gumroad, and Buy Me a Coffee. For now, thank you again for staying with us to the last line. Until the next case, be wary of men who leave clues too neatly, distrust every crime that seems too theatrical, and remember, sometimes the ugliest murders are not committed in passion, but written quietly into the account books of respectable men.